So the Louisville Gardens made a little news this week here in town, and some people picked up on it on Twitter and were tweeting the. I don't know if it's news. I'm still waiting to hear more details, and that this is something that's actually going to happen, because we've heard this before around here in Louisville. Apparently, though, this time the plan is for the gardens to become converted into a film stage, and then potentially offices, because there are other ancillary offices and a floor in the upper front of the gardens that could be used for offices and or things. But again, we've heard it before. At one time, they were going to revamp it as an arena, and then another time they were going to, for in some fashion, make it into high-priced downtown condominiums. And then at another time, I think it was going to be a hotel / entertainment complex with restaurants or something. And there's all kinds of grand plans that have been announced over the past 20 years now, but there were bare bones minimum details on this. It wasn't like an announcement of we're breaking ground next week. This was another plan, but it was, so we'll cross our fingers. But I should mention, I guess, for the newer listeners or the people on the Isle of Malta, that the Louisville Gardens has been closed to events for the better part of the last 20 years. OVW, Ohio Valley Wrestling, we promoted The Last Dance there in June of 2001. That was when The Undertaker was in the main event, because the building was closing to everything. And then, because it's still been owned by the city, for a few years after that, they would rent it out on a limited basis, because it's been a subject of sore feelings here in the community that they spend like almost $1 million a year or some ridiculous amount just to keep the electricity on and the bare minimum, maintenance, that the whole place doesn't fall in. It's in fairly bad disrepair. But they would rent it out a few times, and I promoted, as the local promoter, the last wrestling event that was held there, which was TNA, at, I believe, either last part of 2006, first part of 2007. And at that time, that was the largest attendance that TNA had at a house show. That's also conveniently the only one I ever promoted for it. But nevertheless, anyway. And since then, there's been and I mean, at that point, we actually had to get toilet paper to put in the bathrooms. And, it was on the verge of closing completely. And then we knew the end had come when they made Alvin move. Did I tell you that story, Brian?
I don't know.
The custodian, Alvin, the guy that had been the custodian of the Louisville Gardens since at least the 80s. I don't know if he'd been there before that. For several years after the Gardens closed as a functioning full-time proposition, Alvin still lived in the basement. And it was spooky down there, boy. I mean, there was an underground place you could pull cars down underneath for, like, when Elvis had to leave the building in the 50s, that the Fabs used to bring their rats down. But I mean, there were rats of the four-legged variety down there long before Alvin moved, and it was a spooky looking situation. But he lived down there for you, and finally they told him, "No, you got to go." And that's when we knew they're not going to do anything else in there, right? And then in the intervening years, and the thing that's helped it's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's got historic designation, whatever list it's on. So it can't really be torn down, but at the same time, they did investigate how much it would come, because it sits right in the middle of downtown, and they would have to do a lot of shit to tear this thing down that would affect traffic in a major, business area in downtown, because this is not like one of those arenas you can just blow up and implode. Across the streets, goddamn government buildings. And I mean, across a narrow city street, not across the interstate, across narrow city street and businesses. And besides that, the walls are between 2 and 3 feet thick. They're concrete walls that were set. That building's 120 years old. It started out as the Jefferson County Armory. It wasn't a sports arena. It was to hold munitions and equipment for the precursor to the Kentucky National Guard. And there was shit in there that could potentially blow up. So it looked like originally a giant airplane hangar on the inside. And, so to tear that thing down would be insane. But the point is, and Brian, and I'm going to dare anybody out there, because I've said this before, but now we got a wider listenership. A lot more research has been done since the last time I said it. Is there another existing arena in the United States of America that has hosted more live Major League Pro Wrestling events in their history in the United States than the Louisville Gardens? Can you think of one?
I think we've done this before, and I couldn't come up with one.
And I want to put that out there again too, because I'm not even at this point. I'm not even trying to hometown the decision. But I can't think, you can't think.
In the United States.
In the United States. Once again, I make the designation United States because we can talk about Arena Mexico. So yes.
Well, Clark and Hall, it's like 5 shows a day.
Well, yeah. And I also make the designation Major League Pro Wrestling because now over the last however many years it's sprung up for, little local, independents to have their own building. But even then, I don't know if they could possibly compete. Because, okay, I want to take some history. We mentioned Scott Teal. Let's talk about our friend Mark James in Memphis, who I did the Tuesday Night at the Gardens book with, that centers on wrestling in the early 70s, the first part of the Jarrett run. And John Cosper had helped with research also, but we did a piece on the history of the Gardens and as a building and as a wrestling arena. And, like I said, the building's almost 120 years old. It was opened in 1905 as the Armory, and that was the name, the Jefferson County Armory. That's the name it had until the early 1960s. At the time that it opened, as I'm looking at my notes here, it was not only the largest building or the largest armory in the state of Kentucky, it was the largest building in the state of Kentucky. And it stayed that way for quite some time. As a matter of fact, hold on, I'm zipping through to condense this a little bit. Do you know, and this is an example of the proliferation of sports arenas in modern times where people just think it's always been like this. The Armory in those days, before modern renovations made it a convention center, reduced seating capacity, put in skyboxes or press boxes, at least. I won't say skyboxes in the Gardens. It could still seat about 9,000 people. That was the biggest arena in the state of Kentucky until Lexington got Memorial Coliseum for the University of Kentucky. So the only reason we ever had a building that could seat more than 9,000 people was because the UK basketball program got so hot. And then when Freedom Hall was opened in Louisville in 1957, that then became the biggest, 16,000 some seats. That was the biggest. And that replaced kind of the Gardens as the premier arena in Louisville. But again, everybody was there, not just in wrestling, but I saw when I was a kid, the Harlem Globetrotters, Holiday on Ice, the Disney on Parade, the circus was there. I saw Earth, Wind, and Fire there the first time. Tickets were $7. That was the building that roller derby would do when roller derby came to town. But it was, pretty much synonymous with wrestling because that had been the primary tenant of the building since they originally started right before the United States entered World War II with using the Armory for gatherings of sporting events because that was the biggest indoor location that they could find. And the first wrestling show was in 1914. Stanislaus Zbyszko was in the main event. All right, think about that. This is a building that Stanislaus Zbyszko main evented the first wrestling show in it, and The Rock worked in it. They started doing a Derby Eve tradition of a wrestling event the night before the Kentucky Derby, and that was a big deal on and off into the 50s. But I mean, it started in 1914, and then Haywood Allen became the promoter full-time in 1935, and from that point, for over 20 years, wrestling was pretty much a fixture at the Armory. The World War II years, they would switch over to a Columbia Gym, which was a smaller, or go outdoors at Swiss Park, because the crowds, the available wrestlers, the available fans were smaller, but they still ran weekly shows in whatever venue for most of that time. And then in the 40s, before television, the wrestling was so hot in Louisville, they were running the Gardens almost every week. And that's when the seating capacity was bigger than it is in modern times. Pat Malone as the Green Shadow drew fucking big crowds there. Wild Bill Longson became the masked Superman. Because during World War II, they had a run of masked guys that got over in Louisville, so they kept repeating that formula. And Longson had been disqualified from military service because he'd had a broken back, and Pat Malone was already in his 40s, but with the mask on, they couldn't tell. And, the big unmasking of the heel became a thing. Orville Brown unmasking Superman. Oh, I'm sorry. Superman 1 was Hans Schnabel. Superman 2 was Longson. But Orville Brown unmasking Superman drew 7,000 people. And that was the same card. Remember the Mildred Burke and Elvira Snodgrass legend?
The legend, yes.
The legend was...
How many people did it draw? Legendarily?
18,000 people for a 1941 match with Mildred Burke and Elvira Snodgrass. And Joe Jarris in the book, Whatever Happened to Gorgeous George in 1973, reported that with the list of big gates and crowds in wrestling history. And that became a thing that people started repeating. Well, they did draw 18,000 people in Louisville, but it was over 3 shows. They never had there was no outdoor event. There was no place that could hold 18,000 people, but Burke and Snodgrass had 3 matches in Louisville that year, and they all drew 6,000 people. So methinks that Billy Wolf started inflating that to make Mildred sound better. Anyway, it was the car ride from Louisville to Evansville on March 27, 1946, where Buddy Rogers insulted Strangler Lewis in front of Luthez and started that beef that lasted most of the rest of their lives. And again, like I said, in the 1940s, late 40s, after the war, before television, they're drawing crowds of 6,000 people, like Primo Carnera versus Jules Strongbow, Luthez and Bobby Bruns. Longson drew against Thez was a big match, drew 7,300 people. Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, throughout the 50s, which was the hottest period because television came in, the Gardens was almost weekly. Leone and Thez got a rematch from the Los Angeles Gilmore Field event on the 52 Derby Eve show. And they drew a rematch in 55, drew 9,500 people, which, according to the local newspaper, included 1,200 underprivileged kids and orphans.
Hey, I should probably know this, and I don't, but I know about that match because you've talked about it in the past. But did Thez and Leone actually go to various cities to rematch the LA match?
Yes, for a couple of years. I mean, well, they wrestled each other in a variety of cities off the notoriety of that match.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. And it was still in 55, that was 3 years later. And that's from what we can tell, the biggest wrestling crowd in the history of the Armory / Convention Center / Louisville Gardens, because if they let the kids in, like I said, before the renovations in the early 60s, it could seat, we've seen basketball game sellouts, and, you can kind of envision 8,000 to 9,000 people in there, but it had to have utilized every goddamn seat and standing space possible in that building. And that had to be the craziest wrestling crowd you've ever seen, because I can't imagine any tighter fit in any building set up like that for a wrestling show. But anyway, then, and we've talked about it, when the local promoter that had taken over for Haywood Allen had died in 1957, then we came under the auspices of the Indianapolis office and Barnett and then Bruiser, and it was an afterthought, and Bruiser just cut it off entirely. And so the town was dark, or the building was dark from 65 to 70. But other than that, on and off in the teens and 20s, often in the 30s and 40s, and very regularly weekly in the 50s, there were big time shows with names of the era, whoever they may be, in that building. And then the early 60s, they were there, just, the crowds didn't come. They took 5 years off, and then Jarrett opened it up in 1970 and ran every week for 27 more years. And then Danny Davis picked up an OVW, and we ran for 3 years there until they closed the fucking building.
Jerry Jarrett never tried to do anything to tie into the Derby?
No, because no.
We're staying on Tuesday no matter what?
Here's the thing. The Derby Eve shows back then worked before television, then even after TV, when it was still kind of an institution and it was just a different time. There was no I don't even think there was a Kentucky Derby Festival back then. But in modern times, starting when I was a kid, there became the Pegasus Parade and the Great Steamboat Race and the Great Balloon Race. And then Thunder over Louisville became a thing, I don't know how many years ago, 20-some years, whatever. There is some major event almost every day in Louisville for the 2 weeks before, starting with Thunder over Louisville and culminating with the fucking, day before the Derby is a big fucking race at Churchill Downs now. So it wouldn't work in the modern times. The Kentucky Derby Festival Commission has taken over the whole thing. Unless you're selling a show to some part of the Kentucky Derby Festival for down at the riverfront, free admission or whatever. No, it's long since gone to where you don't run really any major entertainment attraction that's not tied into the Derby Festival anywhere around Derby time. And that includes the concerts at the fairgrounds and everything else that's part of the Derby Festival now. There ain't no room. Does that answer your question?
That answered my question.
All right, well, don't dare bring something like that up again.
Hey, before, let's say, 1962, what are the biggest touring matches? And we're talking about Thez and Leone. What other matches gained such great notoriety that the match itself could go on tour?
Oh, God.
Outside of the home territory of wherever it took place with the big
Well,
star.
but now I would think that Thez and Gagne off the early 50s television would have been attractive anywhere. But it didn't happen it did happen a few times. It didn't happen often. Good Lord.
Thez and Rogers happened in the 50s, but was it, that's it's not as big as Leone and Thez in the 50s, obviously.
No, and it wasn't. It was a big match between two big stars, but nobody at the time knew just, exactly what was the undercurrents of their personal feelings and et cetera were. But it's almost like Thez was starting to become the elder statesman and Rogers was still on the way up there. And that's, when Thez dropped the title to leave the country, do the international tour, Rogers was still getting bigger. Rogers' best years were 60 at the gate, were 61 and 62, and Thez was semi-retired and picking his spots at that point until they asked him to come back and take it. So
what about Kowalski and Yukon Eric?
That was probably attractive, but I would think only in the Canada, the northeastern United States, where either one of them ever linked or tied up out west. Fez and Leone made a lot of news, and because of the national TV and the power of the Los Angeles TV at that time, Gagne was on the Chicago television, so he was a serious wrestler. Gorgeous George was on the LA TV. He drew houses to see him, but there wasn't necessarily a touring opponent that was a big money match. It was just, we're going to see Gorgeous George. So I don't know. Most of the big world title matches, if they had a rematch.
How do you think you would have handled Gorgeous George as a booker, knowing that you can get people, because of the time and place, into the door to see him at least once? What do you do about keeping them?
Gosh, back in that period of time, it was completely different, different perception in the part of people as to wrestling and whatever, and whether booking was good or bad. I wouldn't think they wanted to sacrifice. Gorgeous George was a heel in terms of his gimmick and in terms of what he did, but you wouldn't want to sacrifice your top babyface in your big city to him or whatever. I would think at that point, I would have always booked Gorgeous George against an upper level babyface that wasn't figured into my title plans or any world title plans, or I didn't want to fucking carry my territory on his back, because I would think that, especially the first time around in the television glory era, George had to go over. So you wouldn't want to beat your fucking top star in your town with this guy who was a good wrestler, but the gimmick overshadowed it. So I would think, but then again, especially in the early days of television, things weren't programmed as tightly as they were in the territory days, with this guy being involved with a program with this guy and a rivalry with this guy. And it was just more the names being matched up like still boxing. So you could afford to say Gorgeous George will be here and he won't be against Bruno. He'll be against Chief J Strongbow. Does that make any sense? He can beat Strongbow. We don't give a shit.
It makes sense. It's an interesting thing to think about what life would be like if you can go back to like the early days of television and apply angles to so many things, because it wasn't like there were angles right away on TV. At least, I mean, other than the matches themselves and the results being angles leading to things.
Well, that's an angle by definition. Originally in the early days of television, the angle was, my God, he pulled his tights when he pinned him. And that would get people up on the apron of the ring and throwing shit and beating on the mat, because that was cheating. And they're just seeing it. So unless you've been going to live wrestling matches, they were just seeing it on television. So, holy shit, he cheated. If they'd have started doing modern wrestling angles, which has been proven by what we've done to the business, if they'd have started out doing modern wrestling angles and nobody selling anything and everybody just whacking each other with blunt instruments, we'd have been out of business in 74 with roller derby, because they would have seen everything and we'd have burned all through it. Just like the last 20 years, they've seen everything. We burned all through it.